Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we are undertaking a deep dive into something truly ambitious, a deliberate act of political imagination packaged as speculative fiction. We're discussing Yanis Varoufakis' Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present.
And the conceptual challenge this book tackles is absolutely crucial for any of us trying to understand the world. For decades, we've been told, explicitly or implicitly, that there is no alternative.
Tina,
Exactly. The famous Thatcherite doctrine. Our systems, our methods of finance, our employment structures, they've become so deeply entrenched that they feel less like political choices and, more like economic inevitabilities,
what is that?
like gravity.
It's the ultimate intellectual barrier, isn't it?
Yeah.
The book's radical firebrand character, Iris, she constantly circles back to this exact point. She argues that Thatcher's greatest triumph wasn't just crushing the unions or winning elections.
No.
It was fundamentally making it impossible for people to even conceive of doing anything unless there was something in it for them.
That completely transactional mindset.
It just dominates all social and economic relations. And if you can't imagine something different, you can't build it.
So if the intellectual barrier is this paralyzing failure of imagination, then the speculative solution offered by Varoufakis is the forced act of imagining an alternative system in minute institutional detail.
Exactly. And that's why we're using this speculative fiction as a critical tool for systems thinking and really for political imagination.
So to be clear, the mission for this deep dive is not to predict the future.
No, not at all. And it's not even to endorse the system that's described. The point is to use it as a powerful lens. It forces us to treat a post-capitalist world not as some vague utopian sketch, but as a fully functioning complex system.
With rules, incentives.
And built-in failure modes. Our goal today is to really dissect that institutional design, focusing on what could be, which, in turn, allows us to fundamentally question the assumptions we treat as unavoidable necessities right here in our now.
Okay, let's unpack this and introduce the author's lens and the diverse voices that are guiding us through this alternative reality. Varoufakis, of course, is a high-profile economist. He was the former finance minister of Greece.
Right, and he's a famously sharp critic of austerity and what he now calls techno-feudalism.
So why fiction? Why not just write a policy paper?
Because I think he understood that a policy paper preaches to the choir. By using fiction, he created a kind of systems laboratory. He could populate it with characters who represent distinct philosophical and political lenses for us, the readers.
And we meet them through the narrator, a character named Yango. First, there's Iris.
Iris the agitator.
Yeah.
Yes, she's the radical Marxist, and her entire worldview is defined by the major defeats of the organized left in the UK.
So the miners' strike, the Wapping dispute, the '87 election.
All of it. That trauma shaped her. She despises commodification, she despises patriarchy, but, and this is key, she's also deeply wary of authoritarianism, even on the left. She has no time for another Soviet Union.
She keeps that critical spirit alive. She's the one who personifies the there is no alternative doctrine as Tina, and then she creates her own radical opposing cousin.
Tatiana.
Right. That, astonishingly, there is an alternative. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it perfectly captures her spirit. She is the soul of ideological resistance.
Then as a counterbalance, you have Eva.
Eva, the cynical liberal.
Yep.
She provides the necessary friction in every conversation.
Absolutely. She's an accomplished economist, a former investment banker, and she was profoundly traumatized by the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse. She saw the belly of the beast.
But she doesn't reject markets.
Not at all. Eva critiques collectivism as, inevitably paving the way to the next Gulag archipelago. She prizes what she sees as genuine free markets, individual liberty, and above all, the inalienable right of consenting adults to transact.
So her perspective is purely pragmatic. She's deeply skeptical of human altruism and state power. She's really the voice of the conventional yet deeply disappointed Western intellectual.
And finally, you have the person who makes the whole thought experiment physically possible. Custa. He's the engineer.
A visionary tech heretic.
That's a great way to put it. His disillusionment began in the arms industry, and then it deepened when his employer, a company called Cornea, deliberately mothballed a superior microchip.
And this chip was for bionic implants, right? It could have helped people.
Tremendously. But they shelved it, simply to maintain a monopoly on their older, less effective tech.
That story really stuck with me. It's such a perfect, concise example of the problem. Custer realized that the corporate profit drive was actively superseding genuine human need and technological potential,
And that epiphany just propelled him. He decided to seek emancipation through technology itself.
which leads him to develop this incredible machine, the Hell PVAM.
The heuristic algorithmic pleasure and experiential value maximizer. Yes, it was intended to be the ultimate virtual reality machine. But Custer's goal wasn't just commercial, it was, at its core, philosophical. He called it the freedom machine.
And his theory was
Yeah.
that if you gave people infinite pleasure, they'd eventually reject it.
Pretty much. His theory was that if you offered people the ultimate, real existing, Geiger's ring infinite, unimpeded satisfaction forevermost, would ultimately recoil from surrendering their minds permanently to the machine. They'd reject the gilded cage.
So it was a test of human nature.
Exactly. Costa believed that this moment of rejection would undermine the very basis of capitalism. Our readiness to think of ourselves primarily as consumers. They'd realize that permanent bliss is a form of purgatory, and that would liberate them from the monopolist's control.
But to make this machine work, he needed to capture a complete quantum picture of a user's desires.
Which led him to invent an instrument to detect the crest,
The cerebral recursive enneagram subatomic trail.
the quantum wake of our lived lives. It's a bit of sci-fi hand-waving, but it serves a purpose.
And here's where the fiction really takes flight. That crest detection system, the thing he designed for his philosophical experiment, that's what accidentally detects a wormhole.
A wormhole connection with the other, now, and an alternative version of himself, a man named Costi.
So this accidental communication becomes the core narrative device. It forces Eva, the cynic, and Iris, the radical, despite their fundamental disagreements, to actually engage with Costi in his world. It's not abstract theory anymore.
Exactly. It transforms their debate from abstract theory into an analysis of actually existing systems.
So the central thesis of the entire book, the thing embodied by Iris's cousin, Tatiana, is this. By meticulously imagining a functioning post-capitalist society. The other, now we strip away the assumed inevitability of our current institutions.
We expose which aspects of our now, things like the stock markets, commercial banking, or wage-based labor, are just political choices.
They're institutional habits.
Right. They are not fundamental economic necessities. And that changes the entire conversation. Instead of arguing about the morality of abolishing something like the stock market, we are forced to analyze the institutional consequences of replacing it with something else entirely. It's systems thinking applied through a wormhole.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because we move from philosophy to the institutional blueprint. The other now didn't just emerge from, a UN resolution.
No, it was born of crisis. Its timeline diverged radically from ours around the 2008 financial crisis. In their reality, that crisis sparked a coordinated digital resistance movement, not the ultimately defeated Occupy movement that we saw.
They called it the Ossify Capitalism Rebellion.
The OC Rebellion, yes. And it was driven by a coalition of techno-rebels. They recognized that simple street protests were just insufficient, so they used financial engineering and digital tools to surgically attack the system's structural vulnerabilities.
They fought financial fire with financial fire.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
Let's elaborate on those groups because they were incredibly precise in their targets. The first were the crowd shorters.
Led by a former banker named Esmeralda, they targeted the financial instruments of mass destruction, the collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs.
Okay, for listeners who may not be deeply immersed in finance, let's just quickly clarify what CDOs are. In our hour, now these were central to the 2008 crash.
They were. They were these synthetic debt bundles packages of often junk mortgages and other low-quality debt. Think of them as financial sausages. You don't really know what's inside.
And they were complex, opaque.
Intentionally so. The crowd shorters' genius was that they unpicked these CDOs to identify which tiny chunks of debt within them were owed by specific, vulnerable households, say, an overdue water bill or a student loan payment.
So instead of protesting outside a bank with a sign, they got strategic.
Hyper-strategic. They organized low-cost, targeted payment strikes, and they compensated those participating households with crowdsourced funds.
So a family would get a few $100s to not pay a specific bill.
Precisely. And by coordinating just enough defaults on very specific tiny debts that were scattered across these massive complex bundles, they caused cascading crashes in the CDO market.
And why was that so effective?
Because it prevented the central banks from being able to quietly refloat or backstop that securitized debt. That's exactly how our crisis was managed, by shifting the losses onto the public balance sheet.
So the crowd shorters made the debt too toxic to save.
Yes, it was true financial guerrilla warfare. They dismantled the toxic debt market from the bottom up.
Okay, so that's group one. Then came the soul sourcers.
These were radicalized traders who really understood capital flows. Their target was pension funds.
Which is ironic, right? Because pension funds represent the savings of the working class, but they're the largest shareholders in major corporations.
The ultimate contradiction.
Mhm.
The soul sourcers crowdsourced nominations of companies with poor records. Those using 0 hours contracts, paying low wages, or with high carbon footprints.
And what did they do with that list?
They organized the mass withholding of pension contributions to any fund that invested in those blacklisted companies. Since pension funds rely on constant inflows of cash to operate, this forced rapid divestment.
That gave them huge leverage.
Immense leverage. Enough to demand fundamental reforms to corporate law, including the single most critical institutional change, the adoption of the one person, one share, one vote model.
We'll come back to that because it's the core of the whole system. The third group was the Blade Runners.
The Blade Runners, who called themselves Neo-Luddites, but they didn't reject technology. In fact, they celebrated automation.
What they rejected was its use for what they called neo-feudalism.
Right, the idea that machines should enrich a handful of billionaires while displacing or impoverishing everyone else. They believed the fruits of automation should be shared.
And their actions were just as targeted.
Profoundly so. They famously organized the Day of Inaction against Amazon. They coordinated a global consumer strike, just a 10% drop in revenue for a single day.
And that was enough.
It was enough leverage to secure a 50% pay rise for warehouse workers globally. They forced reforms on big tech, and eventually they secured legal recognition for individual property rights over our own data.
So this concerted, digitally coordinated effort, crowd shorters, soul sourcers, Blade Runners, it leads directly to the institutional core of the other now.
Which is corpo-syndicalism.
Which is essentially legally mandated worker-managed cooperatives, or WMCs, replacing traditional corporations.
Exactly. The entire structure is built around eliminating that hierarchical separation of ownership and labor.
The foundational principle is what?
No bosses, no wages, one person, one share, one vote.
That's a huge shift. So companies operate under a flat management model with what the book calls spontaneous order.
Yes, staff autonomy is absolute. If you don't like a project, you vote freely with your feet. You simply move to a different team or project where you perceive greater value or interest.
Eva, the skeptic, would immediately ask, doesn't that just lead to total anarchy? I mean, who cleans the toilets if there's no boss to tell you to?
And that's the genius of the self-regulating mechanism. The vacuum created by the absence of a boss or a fixed hierarchy forces collective assessment. Well, if a project is losing value, or if an essential task like cleaning the toilets is not being done, the desk is suddenly empty. People migrate to higher value work, and the observable gap where the low value or neglected work remains provides immediate collective pressure to address it.
So the problem becomes visible to everyone.
And the group has to solve it, either by automating the task or democratically assigning it, maybe on a rotating basis. The problem creates its own solution.
Okay, let's focus on the share structure, because you said this is the institutional linchpin. There are no external shareholders.
Crucially, no external shareholders and no tradable shares. Every staff member receives a single, non-tradable personal share upon joining.
And that share isn't a claim on profits.
No, this is the key. It's not a claim on others' profits. It is merely a franchise right to participate in decision-making.
A right to vote.
A right to vote. This single mechanism fundamentally shifts the legal fiduciary duty of the firm away from maximizing short-term shareholder value and toward long-term collective stability and stakeholder interest.
It reintegrates the political sphere voting rights and the economic sphere profit distribution.
Right. It completely counters the capitalist model where power scales directly with wealth. More money, more shares, more votes. Here, it's always one person, one vote.
That immediately addresses the problem of short-termism, which plagues our economy. It forces CEOs to prioritize quarterly results over long-term R&D or environmental sustainability.
Gone. That pressure's just gone.
But if there are no wages, how is the money divided? How do people get paid?
The company revenue is democratically split by preferential voting into 5 fixed slices.
Okay, what are they?
First, a flat 5% corporate tax that goes to the state. Second, fixed operational costs, rent, materials, etc. Third, a slice for R&D and investment.
So far, so standard.
Right, but then the last 2 are different. Fourth is basic pay. This slice is divided equally among all staff members, regardless of their role or seniority. It ensures a baseline security for everyone.
And the fifth slice.
Bonuses. This is the slice that rewards merit and contribution.
I want to spend a moment on this bonus allocation, which they call the Eurovision model, because this is where the system tries to achieve meritocracy while eliminating that top-down despotism of a boss.
It's a remarkable piece of institutional design. It's really clever. Every year, each staff member receives a number of merit points, say 100 points, and they have to distribute those points among their colleagues.
But not to themselves?
Critically, not to themselves. The percentage of the total bonus fund a person receives is directly proportional to the total merit points they collected from their peers.
So it's a system of institutionalized peer review. But the risk, surely, is that people just form cliques and give points to their friends.
And they thought of that.
Hmm.
The whole system is built on radical transparency to curb that kind of reciprocity and prevent informal power networks from forming. The book describes this visual display, a laser-powered hologram of everyone's avatars, with arrows showing the flow of points. The thickest of the arrow shows how many points are flowing.
So you can see everything.
Everything. Dave and Tammy can't just collude to give each other maximum points because the entire flow of appreciation is visible to the entire company. If a small clique is clearly giving disproportionate points to each other, the collective sees it, and the social pressure acts as a powerful counterweight.
So it forces people to genuinely earn respect and recognition, rather than just cultivating favor with a boss.
That's the goal.
Okay, moving beyond the firm itself, the other, now fundamentally changed property rights, specifically the common ownership of land and resources.
This is a huge one. The Great Ground Reform Act abolished private ownership of land entirely.
Completely.
Completely. Land becomes publicly owned and is administered by local, regionally decentralized bodies called Ground Commons Authorities, or GCOMs.
That's a massive shift. Land rent or ground rent is maybe the oldest source of unearned income in history.
Exactly. They just eliminated it from the private sphere.
But how do they distribute land in an efficient, non-corrupt way if they can't use a market price? This is where Eva's skepticism would be screaming about state centralization.
Right. And they solve it with a really elegant market mechanism, just one without private ownership. They divide land into commercial zones and social zones.
Okay.
The commercial zones are managed by something called the Permanent Auction Subletting Scheme, or PASS.
How does PASS work?
It's a self-revelation mechanism. The current occupiers of a piece of commercial land have to self-declare its market value, and the rent they pay to the GCOM is based on that declared value.
So if I occupy a prime commercial building in the city center, I set my own rent by declaring what I think it's worth.
Exactly. But here's the accountability mechanism that keeps everyone honest and ensures maximum public revenue. Anyone can submit a higher rent bid to the GCOM at any time.
Anyone?
Anyone. If they bid higher, they get the right to take over the property after an appropriate transition period.
So if I try to cheat the system and set the value of my city center boutique at, say, $1,000 a month,
Someone else will immediately bid $10,000 and you're out. It forces a continuous public self-revelation of the true market value of the land.
even Eva, the cynical liberal, has to admit that's a sophisticated solution.
She does. She begrudgingly recognizes it as a clever mechanism that solves the problem of public price discovery without needing private ownership. And all that revenue from past funds, local services, and the central state.
And what about the social zones? How is housing handled?
That operates differently. Housing there is allocated via a randomized digital raffle. Everyone gets a chance at subsidized or non-commercial housing.
A lottery.
A lottery, yes. And crucially, the odds of winning that lottery are reduced for people who have higher savings in their personal accounts.
So it effectively penalizes those who could afford to bid for land in the commercial zones.
It does. This guarantees tenure and provides a defense against monopoly control over a basic necessity like housing. Housing is secured as a right, not treated solely as an asset class for speculation.
Which brings us to the abolition of commercial banking and this system of universal dividends through what they call the Jerome system. This might be the most transformative pillar of all.
I think it is. The central bank provides a personal capital account, a per cap account, to every single resident. This completely replaces private commercial bank accounts.
So no more Chase, no more Bank of America.
All gone. And this system is funded by the corporate and land tax revenues we just talked about. This allows them to abolish all personal income tax, sales tax, and VAT.
Wow. So the state only raises revenue from collective economic activity and collective property like land.
That's right. And the per cap account isn't just one account. It has 3 distinct purpose-driven funds inside it.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the legacy fund. This is a substantial trust fund, initially set at $100,000, given to every single baby born.
100 grand at birth.
Yes, and it's illiquid until they reach adulthood. The goal is to ensure every citizen starts their adult life with some inherited capital, countering the crushing cradle-to-grave inequality that defines our now. It's an attempt to equalize the starting lines.
That's a huge deal. What's the second fund?
The second is the dividend fund. This is the source of the monthly universal basic dividend.
A UBI.
Correct. It's funded primarily by that 5% corporate tax slice from all the WMCs, and also by returns on society's collective capital, like the sovereign data fund, which we can get to later.
And this monthly payment, it guarantees freedom from destitution.
Yes. It eliminates the need for all that demeaning, cruel, bureaucratic means testing. It provides people with the economic security to provide what the book calls priceless contributions to society that no market can properly value.
Like caring for relatives or environmental conservation or non-commercial artistic pursuits?
Exactly. And Iris would argue that this dividend single-handedly eradicates the kind of exploitation we see in the gig economy today. 0-hours contracts, delivery app workers.
Because nobody's desperate for the next payday just to survive. They have a baseline of security.
Right. And the third fund is the accumulation fund. This is just a standard savings account for all your earned business income, your basic pay, and your bonuses.
So this is where merit-based inequality is allowed to express itself.
Yes. Those who contribute more, as judged by their peers through the bonus system, will have higher deposits in their accumulation fund.
How did they convince everyone to move their money out of the established private banks and into this new central bank ledger? That must have been a monumental political fight.
It was done through a very clever incentive mechanism. A 5% effective interest rate offered on the accumulation fund, coupled with the abolition of all personal taxes.
A guaranteed 5% return.
A guaranteed, risk-free 5% return, paid as a tax relief initially, and later as a direct credit for any unspent money kept in your per cap account for a full year. Commercial banks simply couldn't compete with that.
Especially with no fees.
And the convenience was key. The central bank's free digital payment system, which was nicknamed Jerome, became the default for everything. It drove the private, for-fee interbank payment systems to extinction.
So this transition solves the core systemic problem of money creation.
It does. Private commercial and investment banking just vanished. They lost their access to the central bank's ledger, and critically, they lost tradable shares, which was their primary source of what the book calls fictitious capital.
As Eva herself taught in Arnau, banks create money ex nihilo out of nothing. They just type numbers into a shared private ledger when they approve a loan.
A private fool's wager on the future. In the other. Now, money creation is centralized, it's transparent, and it's democratic. It relies on plain vanilla loans made only between individuals and cooperatives, all piggybacking on that transparent digital Jerome system.
Okay, let's zoom out now and map this entire architecture. We've got a set of these interlocking institutions, WMCs, pass per cap, and they all seem designed to diffuse power and ensure constant accountability, moving beyond just, voting every few years.
The power diffusion is entirely intentional, and it relies heavily on classical political systems, particularly ancient Athenian democracy, where randomness was seen as an ally against tyranny.
You see that in the county associations.
Exactly. The bodies that oversee land division and resource allocation, they're composed of randomly selected members. They loathed elections.
Why?
Because they believed elections merely select for the wealthy and the ambitious. They preferred the inherent impartiality of the lottery, of sortition.
But the most potent modern check on corporate behavior isn't a governmental regulation, it's these citizens' juries.
Precisely. These are regional panels of randomly selected local citizens. They're drawn from digital stakeholder communities, customers, users, people living near a factory, and so on.
And their job is to grade every single corporation on a social worthiness index.
Yes, and this index is the literal Damoclean sword hanging over every company's strategy. If a company consistently prioritizes profit maximization over, say, environmental protection or labor democracy, and its social rating falls below a certain threshold,
What happens?
deregistration, closure, or the firm is put out to tender for a new management team to take over.
Wow, that dramatically changes the incentive structure.
Completely. Power is permanently equalized. One person, one share, one vote. But merit is recognized by peers through the bonus system. You can gain influence through hard work and recognize contribution, but you can never buy more decision-making rights.
And this links directly back to the structure of the WMCs and something called the disjointedness criterion, or DC.
The DC is the institutional mechanism that formalizes that impossibility of measuring joint contribution. It's a simple rule.
Okay.
If an individual's contribution is objectively measurable, like a plumber fixing a specific pipe, then the DC applies, and they're paid a fee for their service. They're a contractor.
What if it's not?
If the value is jointly produced, like a waiter or a designer contributing to the overall culture of a cafe, or an engineer contributing to a tech firm's output, then the DC does not apply. In that case, they must be offered a share in equal decision-making power. They have to be a full member.
So it institutionalizes teamwork over transactional, individualized labor.
Yes, it draws a bright line.
This whole system reorients the corporate narrative. It replaces the submission that's inherent in waged labor, that core Marxist critique that if one of us is waged, none of us are free, with autonomy.
With democracy at work. Eve, who is Eva's alter ego in this world, makes a brilliant point. She argues that even under capitalism, the moment someone is hired, they leave the so-called free market and they enter a planned system. The firm.
Right, the firm itself is a top-down command economy.
It is. The only difference in the other now is that the relations within that planned system are democratic and accountable, not despotic, where the owner or the shareholders dictate all the terms.
So we map the feedback loop of the other. Now what we see is a focus on collective resilience, a system designed to absorb shocks.
You start with shared ownership, the WMCs, the per cap system. That naturally favors long-term collective interest over short-term private gain.
Which leads directly to reduced inequality and freedom from destitution, thanks to the legacy and dividend funds.
And that, in turn, creates robust political stability. You don't have masses of people living one payday away from ruin, which is a recipe for political chaos.
And that stability allows for rapid, centralized, and clean responses during an economic crisis.
Like the central bank handling their crunch of 2022, but just replenishing everyone's per cap accounts directly, avoiding bank runs and years of crippling austerity.
Now, let's sharply contrast that with the feedback loop that Costa argues is dominating. Now, what he calls the technostructure. This is where the critique of contemporary capitalism really sharpens.
In our reality, the feedback loop runs like this.
Yeah.
You have liquid share markets and the ability of commercial banks to borrow fictitious money from the central bank.
Which leads to the massive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very few, maximized by short-term dividends and constant speculation.
This generates enormous systemic instability. You get fictitious capital, massive debt instruments that fools wager on the future.
Until the inevitable crisis hits, like in 2008 or 2020.
And when it does, it's met by immediate state bailouts, a massive transfer of private losses directly onto taxpayers.
Which only leads to increased concentration of power. The bankruptocracy and the technostructure get even bigger and more powerful, ready for the next cycle.
It's a mechanism designed for continuous private accumulation, even if it requires periodic government-subsidized systemic collapse to keep it going.
The other now, by contrast, seems optimized for shared stability.
And that stability comes from removing the central mechanism of speculation, the tradable share, which is what allows ownership to be divorced from labor and accountability in the first place.
Okay, let's bring these concepts back to the core anxieties of our now. The book doesn't just describe an alternative, it uses that alternative to critique our present reality. First, let's look at automation and the future of work.
This is a powerful contrast. In our now, automation is generally perceived as a Luddite threat. It's technology used as an instrument of neo-feudalism that pushes wages down, displaces workers, and concentrates all the returns in the hands of the owners of the intellectual property.
It's a source of anxiety.
A huge source of anxiety. But in the other base, now, because every citizen has a basic dividend, and the workers are the collective owners of the firm, automation is embraced. It's seen as a force for shared benefit.
So they're not afraid of the robots taking their jobs.
Not at all. The democratization of corporations, coupled with that guaranteed safety net, forced the WMCs to invest heavily in automating chores. The focus was on eradicating what the book calls meaningless work.
All those countless soul-destroying jobs that people endure just so governments can boast of low unemployment statistics.
Exactly. Automation frees up human labor to engage in higher value, more creative, or non-commercial pursuits. It shifts the entire purpose of technological advance from wealth extraction to human liberation.
This connects directly to the problem of inequality and the concentration of power, particularly the technostructure and the rise of techno-feudalism.
Costa argues that the technostructure, the massive shareholder-owned megabanks lending mega debt to mega firms, is essentially a privately owned, Soviet-like planned system.
That's a strong claim.
It is, but his point is that it controls governments and ideology far more effectively than any state ever could. The market is supposed to be this decentralized, spontaneous thing, but the reality is that a handful of mega firms coordinate the global economy despotically.
He makes that famous comparison about the big tech racket. Could you unpack that for the listener?
It's a stark comparison. Costa points out that even a renowned exploiter of labor like Walmart pays out roughly 40% of its total revenue in wages to its employees.
Okay.
Contrast that with big tech giants like Facebook, which pay maybe 1% of their revenue to their employees and precisely 0% to its users.
Who are providing the actual raw material?
Who are the product? Big tech's profits rely on treating users as unpaid data laborers, inputs to gigantic behavior modification machines, without paying any rent for that labor or that property.
So how did the other now counter this?
Through the Digital Rights Acts, which granted full property rights to individuals over their personal data, and this led to the creation of the Sovereign Data Fund.
What was that?
It's a crucial institutional countermeasure. Any company wishing to use massive pools of collectively produced data like Google, using medical data to develop diagnostic tools, has to pay a royalty into this Sovereign Data Fund, which is controlled by the citizens.
And what happens to that money?
That fund, in turn, is used to finance future collective technological breakthroughs. It ensures that collectively produced data benefits the entire community, not just a few private monopolies.
They even had a micromechanism, Tenny, for your thought.
Right, which required app developers to pay users directly, even if it was fractions of a cent, for their data consumption. It institutionalizes the idea that if data is the new oil, then the oil field belongs to everyone, not just those who bought the drilling rights.
Next, let's look at the immense existential problem of environmental collapse and economic growth.
Now, Costa and Iris argue that extractive capitalism channels our best and brightest minds toward, in their words, humanity's destruction.
That it has doubled down on our extinction.
Yes. They cite the rise of phony markets for carbon pollutants and the immense political control purchased via lobbying and think tanks, which ensures that any meaningful systemic environmental reform is always stalled or watered down.
The other, now, by contrast, is institutionally designed for survival. We already mentioned the corporate accountability mechanism.
The Social Worthiness Index. That's the first line of defense, curbing environmental and social abuses by threatening companies with closure.
But on a global scale, they instituted something called the Trade Imbalance Levy through their version of the IMF, the International Monetary Project.
This is a really sophisticated way to force global stability. In our now persistent trade surpluses, like in Germany or China, and persistent deficits, like in the U.S., destabilize the entire world economy. They create massive debt cycles that lead to crises and austerity.
So the Trade Imbalance Levy penalizes both persistent deficits and surpluses. How does that work?
If one country persistently exports more to another than it imports, both countries are charged a levy, say, 5% to 10% of the value of that imbalance.
Both countries.
Both. And this is key, that money does not go into either country's treasury. Instead, it funds something called the International Redistribution and Development Depository, which channels development funds to disadvantaged regions around the world.
So it stops that destabilizing cycle where deficit countries spiral into debt to surplus countries, which often leads to IMF bailouts that demand they sell off public assets to oligarchs.
It prevents that economic poison, the austerity, the debt spirals that breeds xenophobia and instability globally. They also coupled this with a surge funding levy on large speculative influxes of money across borders.
A tax on hot money.
Exactly. A tax that makes it prohibitively expensive for Wall Street-style hot money to invade a poorer country, inflate an asset bubble, and then quickly exit, causing a currency collapse. They essentially built a global system designed to prevent the predatory financial practices that ruin their own hour now.
But the underlying critique remains that all these institutional constraints were necessary because the greatest barrier to systemic change is the political constraint of imagination. And Eva, the cynical liberal, perfectly embodies this resistance.
Eva's core resistance is philosophical. It's rooted in classical liberalism. She views the ban on tradable shares as the first step along the road to serfdom.
A threat to the inalienable right of consenting adults to transact.
That's her line. She chooses what she calls dictatorship in the workplace, our version of capitalism, as a necessary prerequisite for what she perceives as liberty at large. She just struggles to accept that a system without the freedom to speculate on assets can ever be truly free.
And what is Costa's systemic counterargument to that profound commitment to market freedom?
His counter-argument is that a system's ability to replicate itself, its short-term survival fitness, is not proof of its ability to survive long-term.
Just because it exists doesn't mean it's sustainable.
Precisely. He argues that capitalism's own ill effects like existential viruses and the climate crisis are destroying its own host. He says the future is a fool's wager, and the technostructure is betting on our extinction because it only maximizes short-term returns. For him, the ban on share trading isn't a radical socialist decree, it's a pragmatic necessity to restore sanity and ensure our collective survival.
Moving to broader themes now, this whole exercise in speculative fiction highlights the limits of our economic imagination, which is a central theme of our channel. Eva, the highly trained economist, she confesses something incredible. Before the wormhole gave her a glimpse of an alternative, she was simply unable to imagine a market society without banks or share markets.
It's not that she thought it was undesirable, she literally thought it was technically impossible.
She was a prisoner of her own cognitive blind spots.
And Varoufakis analyzes this phenomenon using this beautiful analogy of the imaginary number. Eva reminds us how René Descartes invented the impossible number, the square root of -1, specifically to lampoon those who accepted what he saw as mathematical nonsense.
But it turned out to be useful.
Incredibly useful. Later, geniuses like Euler and Gauss showed that many crucial problems in physics and mathematics could only be solved if you were prepared to suspend disbelief and assume that this imaginary number actually existed.
So, by forcing them to study markets without capitalism, the other, now the impossible, became the intellectual key.
It unlocked a critical understanding of our now. It made Eva realize that a proper market revival, one based on genuine competition and transparency, actually requires the end of capitalism's hierarchical structures.
It also highlights the theme of systems versus inevitability, especially around the 2020 pivot point. The failure to dismantle the technostructure after 2008 just allowed it to grow stronger.
So when the 2020 pandemic hit in our now, the state intervened massively, revealing this immense non-accountable power. But that power was immediately captured by the technostructure, Amazon, Netflix, Google shareholders.
Which led to the bleak 20s feedback loop in our now. The failure to oppose corporate power in 2008 and 2020 led to the rise of finance and nationalism.
And a new kind of authoritarianism, using big tech tracking systems, tracking coughs that could be repurposed to monitor laughs, and this widening gulf between the beneficiaries, the shareholders, and the sufferers.
Eva's former boss, the banker, became the head of a government task force to refloat Wall Street.
While Eva's alter ego in the other world, Eve, chose to join the crowdshorters' rebellion. The pandemic was a portal, a gateway, and our now chose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks, and dead ideas. The other now made a different institutional choice during its crisis.
And yet, even in the other now, paradise is not perfect. The way fiction can reveal hidden assumptions is demonstrated by this event called the DCCS scam and the crunch of 2022 in their reality.
This is a critical point. The crisis proves that market mechanisms are inherently susceptible to speculative bubbles if they are not perfectly constrained.
So even with no private banks and equal shares, people found a way to gamble.
They found a way to develop these things called mixed credit rights, or MCRs.
What were they?
They essentially combine individual savings from their per cap accumulation accounts with the future public land rents from the GCOM's pass system.
And then they traded them.
They created an improvised, unregulated digital trading platform for these MCRs. They essentially reinvented securitized debt on their own.
And a bubble formed.
A huge bubble. When a random event, a major flood, caused land prices to drop, the bubble burst. It crashed community currencies and drained individual per cap accumulation accounts.
So it was a familiar calamity.
It was. And it demonstrated Iris's deepest fear, that human nature hates a hierarchy vacuum and will always find ways to exploit any system based on exchange value. But the response was radically different because of their institutional design.
Right.
Since the commercial banks were gone, the central bank was able to act immediately. It just replenished the per cap accounts directly and globally, stabilizing the economy without the political paralysis of bailouts or the threat of austerity.
So the system bent, but it didn't break.
Exactly. It highlights the ultimate value of the democratic institutions they had built. They created collective resilience and a transparent mechanism for recovery, but they did not eliminate the human impulse for speculative greed.
That brings us to our reflection. The Dollar Now deep dive demonstrates that key capitalist components, the stock exchange, commercial banks, wage labor, and private land ownership, can, at least in theory, be replaced with functioning, democratic, market-based alternatives like corpo-syndicalism, per cap, and pass.
And the linchpin of the whole system is that single, non-tradable share. It forces the acknowledgement that objectively measuring personal contributions to a joint endeavor is impossible, and it fundamentally changes the direction of corporate strategy away from short-term shareholder gain toward collective long-term stability and social worthiness, as judged by those citizens' juries.
The ultimate choice, though, hinges on how you define freedom, feasibility, and survival. Eva, the cynical liberal, despite recognizing the technical superiority and the greater stability of the other now, she chooses to stay in our now.
She does. She prefers the freedom to trade shares. She sees the other now as sacrificing essential liberties for centralized, albeit democratic, control. For her, she cannot divorce the concept of freedom from the right to transact capital.
But the most provocative thought, I think, comes from Iris, the radical. She also refuses to cross over, despite acknowledging that the other now is far better and more humane.
Her ultimate conviction is that freedom of the market, even a democratized, non-exploitative one, still prioritizes that transactional quid pro quo mentality. And she believes this undermines the sovereignty of good, the ideal of unconditional collaboration that she fought for her whole life.
So she chooses to stay in our horrid now rather than live in a much better version of it.
Because that better version, she fears, only makes the prospect of a true abundance communism, a Star Trek society where material scarcity is irrelevant, feel even further away. She says, I did not waste my youth fighting against Thatcher's campaign to reduce all values to prices only in order to migrate now to a place where markets are even more stable, sustainable, and admired.
She sees it as a better cage, but a cage nonetheless.
This leaves us with the critical question, the one that remains unanswered in the end. In the fight against planetary extinction and systemic oppression, should we focus on designing markets that are fair, competitive, and sustainable, like the other? Now, or should the true aspiration be a society where material needs and the very need for market exchange are eliminated entirely? It forces you to consider not just feasibility, but the ultimate definition of human liberation.
That is Yanis Varoufakis' Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present.
We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author's work, or check it out from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.